Okay, everyone, we'll get started now. Thank you all for attending this midterms political update. It's good to have each of you here. We are recording this session and it will be available after we conclude today. I'd like to recognize the NRMCA Government Affairs Committee Chairman, Scott O'Lean, to say a few words of welcome.
Hey everyone, good afternoon, and welcome to the last political update before the midterm election, which is now only 8 days away. And as you're aware, the political landscape has been changing in parts of the country. There's been some movement in some of the key races leading up to the midterms. So this will be an interesting discussion. And Andrew and Jeff and Danny will analyze all that for us. But first, I want to remind everyone that this meeting will be held in strict compliance with the NRMCA antitrust statement, which is displayed on your screen. With that, I will turn it over to Andrew.
Thanks very much, Scott. A couple of housekeeping items in our agenda here. We are recording this, as I mentioned, so if everyone would just keep yourself on mute unless you have a question. If you do have a question, you can either feel free to drop it in the chat box or the question and answer box, and then we'll either take it or, at an appropriate time, please feel free to ask your question and get our attention so we can have a good discussion about the upcoming election. So our agenda will be as follows. We thank you, Scott, for the welcome and the open antitrust statement. We'll talk about the race for the House of Representatives. Spend a few minutes on that, as it's not as much of a question mark as the Senate is, but we do have a number of important races that we want to highlight and take a look at when it comes to the House. And we'll spend some time on the Senate, look at the battleground states, the real battleground states and the purported battleground states, look at a couple wild cards that could come into play, and then get some predictions from Danny and from Jeff, and then want to just talk a little bit about what to look for on election night just a week from today. So with that, and of course, we'll take questions and discussion at that point. I know we've received a couple as we had registrants enter them as they were registering. So with that, let's kick off the discussion of the House elections. And Danny, I'm going to turn it over to you to give us a little overview here on what to expect in the House elections next week.
Sounds good. Thanks, Andrew. Hey, everybody. The House is going to be probably the easiest part of our discussion tonight, although I think there's some things that we should all keep our eye on. As you see, my first bullet on here is the GOP is going to win the House of Representatives. This Real Clear Politics projection you're looking at with the individual districts listed, that 221 number is 3 over the requirement for the majority. Now, that's taking into account races that are considered lean. In other words, they're not a guarantee for the GOP, but for the Democrats to get their 218 or 218 plus, they're going to not only have to win every single one of those 38 toss-ups and their 11 lean Democrats, they're also going to have to win some percentage of the lean GOP, which is just not only highly unlikely, it's almost an impossibility. Some of the key races, and I think we'll probably emphasize this again, interesting races to watch because they're going to be bellwethers for the rest of the country to see where things are going. Virginia 7, you have Spanberger versus Vega. Rhode Island 2, you have Fung, who is the GOP candidate, who is a mayor, polling way ahead of the Democrat in a New England district that hasn't been held by a Republican in decades. Maine 2, Poliquin's making a comeback. New York 17, you got Sean Patrick Maloney in a fight with Mike Lawler. And then Texas 34, you have two incumbent representatives, a Democrat and a Republican. One, I think most people know, Myra Flores, who was recently elected in a special election, and I think a good bellwether. But I want to turn it over to Jeff to kind of continue the conversation on key races to watch, but also get his thoughts on some of the issues driving these races and what to look for.
Oh, great. Thank you. I think that one of the things, just following on your introduction, Danny, that I would share, when you look at estimates, I've been doing this, I guess, for about 22 years now. And the thing that I would tell you is real clear, as much as it gets poo-pooed by Nate Cohn and 538 and other folks like that, tends to be consistently the most accurate predictor because of the way they do the aggregation across races. The 38 toss-ups that are listed, it's almost universal that toss-ups break late, almost overwhelmingly for the party not in the White House. When there's a contentious election like this, we saw this in 06, 08, 10, 14, and 18, where, for example, when I was regional vice chair for the NRCC at the end of the last week of October, or I guess third week of October of 2010, we were projecting 45 or more seats, and we ended up with 63. Actually, I think we're at 50 at that point, but you get a whole bunch that break late and come over. And I think you're going to see that here with a substantial net pickup, probably 35 plus or minus 5, frankly, wouldn't be surprising at this point. I think you picked some great races to watch. And, particularly the Virginia race with Spanberger is going to be fascinating to see. Jared Golden up in Maine is going to be one that's going to be, amazing in terms of its impact. I don't know if ranked choice will end up helping him or hurting him with their strange voting up there, but I think you're going to see one of the things you're going to see is the angst among the Democratic Party right now as they're doubling down on issues that inside the DC Beltway will animate them, but they're not resonating in districts they have to win across the country. And ironically, first canary in the coal mine was up in Wisconsin in the Senate race up there when you saw, I know we're going to switch over that in a second, but when you saw all the Democrat messaging switch to preserving democracy and giving everybody the right to an abortion, that's just, frankly, regardless of your politics, it doesn't resonate well when you're losing 6% of your value every year, or 10% of your value in your retirement plan, or you're spending $400, $500, $600 a month extra at the grocery store. And that's really, we're coming down to visceral politics. So House is going to be exciting. And, with that, I'll kick it back over to you, Dan.
Yeah, I think, Jeff, I think you're speaking to an important point, and an important point across the races, not just the House elections, but the Senate and the gubernatorials as well. One of the things that I haven't heard it phrased exactly this way, but I've been saying to the candidates that we're working with and supporting is, the difference between the economy and inflation and abortion is a topic that is really something that comes up maybe once in a person's lifetime. So even if it is of importance to someone, it's not something that is a day-to-day concern where putting food on the table and making sure you can make your car payment, making sure, the mortgage is covered. That's an everyday, every couple hours, every week concern that families are having. And I think we're really seeing this trend towards the GOP because of how out of control that issue is. And you see it in all the polling. It's definitely the top issue. I do have in here some upset surprises, top 3 races to watch. I think for me, you pick any upstate New York congressional race. I think that is going to be a bellwether. I would say Virginia 7, 10, or 2 are going to be important. I know I'm a little biased being a resident, but I think those are really important in terms of which way the country's going. And there's something you can check on early, right? Early in the election evening, you can say, hey, where's everything headed? if you see a bunch of races that are flipping in New York, Virginia, Pennsylvania, as the polls close, you've got an idea of what the night's going to look like. But I think that covers it for the House broadly right now. I know we're going to come back to a couple of things on the House, including candidate quality, which is always an issue, but something we're going to talk a little bit more in depth here with the upcoming Senate slides. Andrew, you want me to just go over this quick?
Yeah.
Yeah. So right now we have a 50-50 Senate. Republicans are actually defending more seats than Democrats are. So it's not as good a year as the GOP could have. I've been reminding folks to keep an eye on 2024 because the map is much, much better for Republicans going into that presidential year than it is this cycle. But there are a lot of seats that there are a couple that the GOP is going to have to defend, but it's mostly Democrats on the offensive here, and we have them broken down into three categories. We have what we're calling our false battlegrounds, states that appear like they're battleground states, but I don't really think they are. The real battlegrounds, so our top four are Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, and then there are a couple seats in here, and this you'll see this map you're looking at. There are a few changes to this. North Carolina, the Real Clear Politics folks actually agree with me now, and they've moved both North Carolina and Ohio into the lean GOP category. There is another surprising move that happened this morning. They've moved Washington from the lean Democrat category to the pure toss-up, with the polls all within 3 points in the Smiley Murray race there. But let's start off with the false battlegrounds. And Jeff, if you want to.
Hey, Danny, before we go any further, I just want
Oh, yeah.
to, underscore sort of from a global, and you have this as your first bullet point, but from a global perspective, I mean, obviously the Senate is going to probably be the most in play in terms of, does it flip, does it not? You're getting the closest to a 50-50 toss up, but with a 50-50 Senate, a shift of only one seat makes the difference in the majority. And so Republicans need to net only one. Of course, they have to defend all of theirs and net one or win one to shift the majority. But that's really what's on the line. And the one seat is really the difference in much of what we've seen come out of the Democratic controlled Congress. The Inflation Reduction Act, the American Recovery Act, all of these things were done through reconciliation, which only required the Senate majority to be at 50 plus 1. And so the control of the Senate is what's up for grabs here. So with that, I'm going to move on to talk about the false Senate battlegrounds, and Danny and Jeff, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, it's interesting watching. If any of you remember the very exciting night in 2016, people considered Ron Johnson a dead man walking in September of 2016, and he was the surprise that told us that nationally something very big was happening when he closed it and won the nomination of Mandela Barnes, a very left-leaning, hardline progressive liberal, probably isn't the best fit for non-urban Wisconsin, and immediately went after Ron Johnson and was addressing a whole lot of issues that certainly might get traction in Milwaukee or La Crosse, where the University of Wisconsin is, but we're having exactly the opposite effect on heartland folks. And Wisconsin is one of those transitional states where you're seeing the Rust Belt with this demographic shift that's taking place inside the parties. Johnson has consistently spoken to issues that rank and file voters tend to care about, especially around the economy. He can be a bit of a curmudgeon, frankly, very abrasive person. However, the counterpoint is the fear that frankly has rolled across the upper Midwest and the heartland with many of the Biden proposals. There's a big feeling that's coming out in polling data too, that there's been a bait and switch with the Biden administration based on how he ran and then what they actually did when they governed. And so it pulls very strongly to have a counter on the White House. What makes Johnson interesting is he stayed very consistently on these messages, regardless of what was happening in political media. And no matter what was said, his numbers continued to come back up. He looked like he was going to win all the way back. The trending was there back into August, but the seat is effectively going to go that way. Wisconsin should have another surprise. The Ron Kind seat has a Republican nominee, Derek Van Orden, as a retired Navy SEAL. He has sort of a Ron Johnson-esque personality in some ways, but he came very close to beating Ron last cycle, and that pushed Kind into retirement. I've watched that for early in the upper Midwest races. If he comes in with a big blowout, Johnson will be fine. Living in Florida, I have to laugh at some of the commentary and interesting polling that's coming up on Rubio's race. The governor, DeSantis, is up 15 points. Marco was up 9 in the last publicly released polling, and he should win comfortably in double digits, which will pull probably a couple of swing House seats over the line as well. But these guys, these candidates are in states that are now becoming structurally Republican. What I would say when the Democrats want to talk about Trump, abortion, and the Republicans are ending democracy, forgetting that they were election deniers in 04 and 16, and it happens every cycle somewhere. But the more interesting aspect of this is these two states are in realignment, and so they're going to be fine. And I think you can basically put them to bed. And the fact that the Democrats have pulled resources from Florida and are quietly pulling resources from Wisconsin is one point. Lastly, going back to an earlier comment, the fact that President Obama went up there and wanted to talk about the end of democracy and abortion as his leading message means they have an activist turnout problem. And so we'll continue to watch that versus the pocketbook issues. In a similar vein, J.D. Vance and Ted Budd are both expected to win. Certainly, you can have weird anomalies come up, but I would say if you look at this as just the tidal physics, if you will, of an election cycle like this, where you have an extremely unpopular administration that even their own pollsters have told them, don't talk about your legislative achievements because they move people away from you. Ohio is another state in this industrial heartland rebalance. Tim Ryan is a great retail politician, but it's Ohio, and Governor DeWine is 21 points ahead. It would be unheard of break to suggest that Vance will probably win close to 10 points. If that's good. And then finally, Ted Budd, Miss Beasley, the former Supreme Court Justice in North Carolina, you occasionally will see some anomalous polling coming out, but every other trend, particularly polling verbatims and in their victory calls, are all running. He's going to be comfortably, elected within several points. And you can also watch some other House races in these battleground states that'll prove this out. For example, I mentioned Johnson in Ohio with the Derek Van Orden race for the Ron Kind seat. In Ohio, one of the big early bellwethers will be Steve Chabot in Ohio 1. He's been moved into an at-risk district. He now has all the metropolitan Cincinnati. If he wins or is within 1 point on election night early, it'll be a good night for Republicans. And then in North Carolina, we're seeing similar trends, but Budd should comfortably be elected at the end of the night.
I think that really covers the false battlegrounds quite well. I don't think there's anything needs to be added to that. We could move over to the battlegrounds. So when I was creating this the slide. It was a little bit of a different situation in terms of where Oz Fetterman stood. For those of you that are paying attention to that race, it is one of the more competitive ones in the country, but we did have a debate last week that has seismically shifted the polling in Oz's favor. Depending on which poll you want to look at, it's between a 6 and 10 point bump toward Oz. That is because John Fetterman suffered a very serious stroke right before the primary and has decided not to withdraw. If you go back and watch the debate, he opens the debate with "Hello, everybody, and good night." So not a strong candidate in that sense. He doesn't seem capable of doing the job from a perspective of people on the ground. A lot of the after actions in terms of people who watched the debate and were undecided have shown that people who are undecided have trended very heavily towards Oz. I think that race is on the right trajectory, the right trend for Oz to hold the seat, even though it's been a bit of a slog because Oz is considered an outsider type candidate. You know, he's a multimillionaire. He's living in New Jersey up until a few months ago. He's not from Pennsylvania. He's from Turkey, served in the Turkish military. So somebody that would be considered definitely not your standard candidate for Pennsylvania, against somebody who the media likes to tout as, you know, a Pennsylvanian in Fetterman. I think the health situation here has shifted this race tremendously. It's moved directly into Oz's camp. It's now Oz's to lose. So that is a big change over the last week to a couple of days. I think the other big change that you've seen in the polling, I think two of these are a bit static with Nevada and Georgia. Nothing's changed tremendously. Arizona's polling has changed tremendously. Masters is much closer to Kelly in the polling. Poll after poll after poll are showing very, very close, low single or no separation in terms of that. But I think that is a race where, unlike the Oz Fetterman contest in Pennsylvania, where Oz has completely separated himself from the gubernatorial candidate Mastriano, Masters has kind of gone the other direction, and he's very much in concert with the GOP gubernatorial candidate Carrie Lake, who's definitely considered part of the further right camp of the Republican Party. However, she's performed incredibly well on TV. She's got her opponent ducking debates, and polling as of last week had her up 11. That seems to be a race where it's very possible that the gubernatorial candidate could pull the Senate candidate over the top with them.
Yeah, I'll throw in one point for you too, Dan, on that race, just for everybody listening. NRMCA and Cal Portland in particular, and I had done a lot to help Martha McSally in her 18 and her 20 race. Just as a data point, going into election weekend in 2020, Martha McSally, the then sitting senator, was 9 points down to Kelly and lost by 2. And so I think that you look at Kelly, if this data is correct, which I think it generally is, and they're within a couple of points, any of these races really, but particularly the Masters race, a couple of points combined with what Lake is doing at the top end, we could see a real surprise in Arizona. It creates a path to 53, potentially 54. The other thing that Lake has done in her race, that Oz has done, Laxalt has done, Masters to a lesser degree, is they've changed their pre-primary messaging to, let's say, more mainstream Republican or mainstream kind of kitchen table issues. and that has taken off a lot of the edge. I guess in our social media age, people don't pay attention to what was said last week. It's the new message now, and if you have the ability to drive that, you can control it. And just wanted to toss that out. You're seeing a similar reset to Dan's point taking place in Pennsylvania as well.
So guys,
Yeah.
Danny and Jeff, just so we frame this, right? We talked about Oz and Fetterman. Now, to be clear, this is a GOP hold if Oz wins. And this is, of course, the Democrats' #1 pickup opportunity throughout the country is Pennsylvania. So retiring Senator Pat Toomey holds the seat now. And so to succeed him, GOP needs to win that to just maintain the balance of power. And then you've talked about Kelly and Masters, and I know there's 2 more here, but just to be clear, that's just to maintain, and that's a GOP hold question, and the others are pickup opportunities. Am I right?
That's right. That's right. And this is the one race on this slide that is actually a GOP hold situation. I think if you look at where's the easiest path to 51, I would shift focus then to Nevada. Adam Laxalt, law and order candidate, former attorney general, challenging Cortez Masto, the sitting senator. I think you look at all these statewide races in Nevada, they're very interesting to watch. Joe Lombardo is the candidate for governor there. He's currently the Clark County sheriff, which is pretty impressive as a Republican representing a deep blue county. He's extremely popular, kind of led Las Vegas through the shooting a few years ago. If you remember the country concert that was shot up, one of the larger mass shootings in American history, he was seen as a, kind of a nonpartisan leader who took, stepped up and, helped the city through that, helped the state through that. And Lombardo is polling a few points ahead of Laxalt in most of the polls, but consistently ahead of the Governor Sisolak, who's the incumbent Democrat there. And as you go down ballot, it does look very strong for the GOP. It's also an unusual state where all 4 of the House seats are competitive. You don't really see many states where all the seats are competitive. Generally, if you see all the seats one way, it's a very, very hard partisan lean where, Massachusetts, for example, or Oklahoma, basically all 5 seats in Oklahoma lean pretty heavily Republican. All 9 or 10 seats in Massachusetts lean pretty heavily Democrat. Nevada is kind of the wild card in there where you have truly 4 toss-ups. And then the last one, to touch on it here a bit, is the Walker-Warnock race. A race that was essentially handed to Warnock by Donald Trump in his comments following the 2020 election, asking Republicans to stay home and not vote. That impacted the polls tremendously. It resulted in a massive decline in GOP turnout in red areas, particularly the deep red areas of the state. Now we have a Trump-backed candidate in Herschel Walker, former Georgia football player, who's not had the easiest go of things. He's made some errors. There have been a few scandals that have been ginned up by the media. And there's definitely some. It's definitely a contentious race. But if you look again to the gubernatorial here, Brian Kemp, who is considered more of the mainstream Republican in the race, is overwhelmingly leading Stacey Abrams, who is supposed to be this big darling of the New York Times and the MSNBC crowd, who is supposed to be just capable of anything. I believe the New York Times wrote a headline, "What isn't Stacey Abrams capable of?" And I think the answer to that is getting elected governor of Georgia. That is definitively what she is not capable of. So Kemp is going to pull away with this race. My prediction, and Jeff, I think we've discussed this. I'd like to get your thoughts on it because I think it is one of the more interesting ones. I think Kemp is going to pull away. If he pulls away in double digits, I think he takes Walker over the top with him. And, you know, there's a good night for the GOP in Georgia.
Yeah, I think you end up with a situation, most of virtually every public forecasting service, and especially the DC pundits. And by the way, anybody who's listening to this or on could become a DC pundit if you read lots of news and, you know, and speculate, and you could be the next Charlie Cook, I suppose. But a lot of it is just looking at, you know, obvious trends in demographics and data. But the pundit class, I know from my own contested elections, doesn't have a feel for what's happening on the ground. They rarely do. And this is one of the, I've been up in Georgia quite a bit. I have a son, actually he's in Ranger School right now, but he was in the infantry school before. And on the ground, it's really fascinating. You talk to people out in the communities, there's a sense that they got burned by being mad at Donald Trump, and they voted for Joe Biden. And frankly, you know, understand what happened with the lower turnout. But there was kind of this prevailing sense that Joe, among the let's say the non-political junkie part of the electorate that would typically vote Republican, that Joe Biden was going to govern as a normal president and not do anything that would, in a sense, fly in the face of the worldview of the bulk of voters. You know, clearly, with a number of pieces of legislation that were moved, not to relitigate any of that, it had the opposite effect. And so I think that, you know, in particular, if you go down the one of the canary in the coal mine races in Georgia is going to be the Sanford Bishop race down in the Columbus area. He's been in Congress for 30 years, and he's in big trouble. It's a 49% African-American district, and he's polling at 49% right now. And not being able to get over that threshold tells us something very significant that's going on, just based on voting trends, is that the Republican nominee in that race has cracked into the African-American voting base on economic issues. And so is forgetting the moralizing that goes on in different aspects of these campaigns. Both parties do it to each other to try to create leverage. The Georgia voting public, particularly Republican-leaning voters, have made a decision that this isn't about whether Herschel Walker is a Rhodes Scholar or not. This is about somebody who's going to vote for the Republican leader and essentially protect Georgia equities because of what's happened. And Warnock can't talk about his voting record, just based on the fact that it sets him back. So we should see an interesting night. The other thing I would tell you were that Adam Laxalt was the first of these to break out into a lead. And the one thought I'll leave you with before we jump to the next item is that we saw with a number of the races in the Texas Panhandle where this has been going, but the fact that the Hispanic community is clearly coming to the Republican side. It doesn't take a majority. All it takes is let's say, an order of magnitude plurality, and nationally the election face has changed completely. And they're seeing the same thing in Georgia with Hispanic voting. Same thing in Arizona is moving out there, and we're going to have a fascinating election. I think it'll be pretty exciting, and hopefully, if you're a Republican voter, I think we've got a good shot at no runoff. Again, look to the Sanford Bishop race in Columbus. If that clears on election night, that'll give a pretty good indicator of where it goes. Back to you.
Yeah, so I think we could jump to the next slide here with the long shots. This is coming down to the wire, so a lot of this has changed since we put this together. I would say the biggest change that has been public has been the Hassan Baldock race in New Hampshire. That was not supposed to be competitive. That was supposed to be, Baldock was supposed to be way outside the Republican mainstream. He wasn't going to be touchable. He wasn't going to get national support. All of that has changed. The national support's coming in big time. They're looking at both House seats as being competitive. Real Clear Politics has shifted the predictions on both House seats. You look at New Hampshire 1, Caroline Leavitt might be the youngest ever Congresswoman elected. She's going to beat previous record holders of, I believe, AOC and prior to that, Elise Stefanik. I believe she's 24 currently. But all of the races have shifted in the GOP's favor in New Hampshire, with a big thing that is going to, it's one of those areas where the people voting for the very popular incumbent Republican governor, Chris Sununu, have not necessarily jumped on the Republican ticket down the line. Sununu's kind of a not quite the never Trump, but a less than positive feeling towards Trump type Republican, where the Trump ticket really did very well in the GOP primaries there, which end very late. They end in middle September. But it seems like Sununu's going to win by 30 points. Does it translate down the ballot? It doesn't look like it right now. And but there are competitive. All three federal races there are competitive. And then I'm going to jump to the other one that's changed the most, and then mention Colorado. But the other big change is Real Clear Politics has not touched Colorado. They have touched Washington, saying that this is a true toss-up. The polling that came out today had Smiley within 6 and within 1. Trafalgar's considered one of the premier pollsters. They were considered the pollster of the 2016 and 2020 cycle. They have had this within 1 the last 3 times they've touched it. Kind of hard to believe that that might be the case. The reason I think I don't think it's going to go is Washington is just historically too blue. I don't think the state is actually winnable. But if you're seeing something where that race is close, you're going to see a lot of pickups across the country elsewhere. And then on the Bennett-O'Day race, not a lot of shifting in terms of the prognosticators. A lot of people are saying O'Day has given Bennett a real run for his money in Colorado. He is a construction industry guy. That is his background. He's made, a good deal of personal wealth in the industry. He's very well liked in Republican circles out there. He's also openly anti-Trumpian in his approach. It's causing him some grief at this point, with the former president speaking out on social media and emailing supporters to not vote for O'Day. Big question mark as to how that is going to play out, but fewer race changes there. And then I think I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to cover those 3, because I think the Lee McMullen animal is a different piece of the pie than those 3 close Democrat incumbent races.
Sure, thank you. One thing to keep in mind, in 2020, we were doing a lot to help Joni Ernst, who some of you know from Iowa, or some guys in our firm have connection going back to the Ranger Regiment from her days as a junior officer, married to a member of the regiment, and so it's just been a kind of a personal interest. She's a great senator, but she was running significantly down going into the election. And about 10 days before the election, I did a deep dive, went back literally to 06 and looked at every battleground statewide, and then did 10, 14, and 18, looking at Democrat and Republican races, how they function. The one thing that we saw consistently across Senate races in particular is that there tended to be a 4 to 7 or 8 point undercount in polling that at least the public was able to digest, which tells me, I don't know if y'all are like this, but I don't do surveys. If I get a call, I just kind of check it off, because I know the data capture systems that are behind those and how much information can be aggregated out of it. So I tend not to participate. And I think you see a lot of folks as well don't want to take positions out of a legitimate concern over social media paranoia. But if you take these races and you lay in that number, I would say anybody who's within a couple of points going into the weekend, with the exception of maybe the Hassan Bulldog, probably the Republican wins. And I do agree that it's probably a long shot in Washington State. The Joe Kent race to fill Jamie Herrera Butler's a seat after she was defeated in the primary. You know, maybe a bellwether on how Smiley ends up statewide. If Kent wins that and wins it with some margin, that's going to be a very good sign for her. You've got House races in Colorado that also could potentially point in that direction. I think one point that Dan had brought up in one of our conversations is that Bennett's internal problem is he's hitting a ceiling that's well below 50%. And I can tell you, just when you're an incumbent and you can't get over that threshold on polling, that increases the pucker factor rather dramatically for you going into election day. Just because people tend to break away from the incumbent, especially when you've got an environment that would be against the incumbent's party. So a day could definitely be the sleeper surprise. It could literally open a door to 53 or 54. The weirdest race, and I'll come back to the Hassan Bolduc finally before McMullen. Back in 2016, a whole lot of us were really leaning hard that Kelly Ayotte could pull it out against Maggie Hassan, who's running. She's a former governor, and she beat the Republican Kelly Ayotte by about 1,000 votes, late on election night. But the big surprise was out in Wisconsin, and that's when we really saw the sea change starting to take hold. Bolduc has taken he's a kind of an eccentric candidate, to put it mildly. Some of the positions and statements that he's made. He doesn't really have money. That's the reason Republicans have rotated most of their assets out of the states to play where they feel they've got an opportunity to win. He may close that gap. The early indicators or tells on that will be watching a couple of the New Hampshire House races, how they play. But the weirdest race of all, though, is going to be the McMullen-Lee race in Utah. We've talked internally back and forth. I've talked to people around the Hill that I know who are watching this. People who get elected to the Senate, in particular, who will not have committee assignments and things like that, don't tend to be particularly effective. And McMullen is sort of an aspiring national leader in search of a position right now. He's trying to capitalize on anti-Trump faction. His supporters in the DC ecosystem are made up very heavily of, and a lot of the money he's been able to garner has come through Lincoln Project affiliated folks. That could say for a whole nother hour to talk about traitors within the Republican Party, or Democrats have their view of people that want to play against their own party internally. But all that said, this probably suggests Lee will be okay in a closer race. And again, a lot of voters are aware right now that this is not so much about the individuals, but what it does for the agenda. And McMullen has basically said he won't caucus with anybody, which means he effectively throws his vote away. He may reconsider that at some point, but the history of the few folks who tried to do that in Senate history, they either kind of quietly fade away or they actually take a committee assignment with a party and caucus with them. My gut would be Lee is probably okay. If McMullen loses, I think we still have the Republicans have the Senate majority, or if Lee loses, but it is a leadership headache at that point for Republicans to figure out, what they're going to do to work around that. And McMullen would become a favorite of, liberal media at that point. So, but not a problem to worry about until after we're through next week. But of these, I think big night, we could see two, possibly, 3 pickups, and could be an exciting time.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Danny. These are all fascinating races to watch, especially I think this race in Washington State, as the rating for it has changed. So I want to talk a little bit about a couple other races, non-federal, some state-based races, but I want to do this just real briefly, Danny and Jeff, and maybe as you comment on the governor's race, I think it's interesting to tie it back to some of what we've talked about already, but the sort of different, the differing degrees with which Senate candidates are tied to gubernatorial candidates. So, for example, Kerry Lake in Arizona, we mentioned, and then, of course, Brian Kemp in Georgia. But then also, what are we going to see in some of these outliers where Michigan, New York, which are kind of surprise in play, or at least New York surprise in play for Republicans, and then Kansas, Oklahoma surprise in play for Democrats. What are you guys looking at, and what should we expect just in a couple of minutes so that we can move on to projections and then take some questions and comments?
Well, I'll take three of these and let Dan take the other, especially since he's from New York. Arizona, the current trending suggests that Lake will win. Georgia, we kind of know what the outcome is going to be, and then the third one I'll talk to is Michigan. Gretchen Whitmer, though she's up in the polls, is very unpopular in the Republican districts of the state. She's extremely unpopular, up in the Upper Peninsula, northern region, think Jack Bergman territory up there, western Michigan. And you get outside of those Democratic vote centers, she's got a problem. And what that can lead to, whether Tudor Dixon can beat her or not, Tudor is an interesting candidate, to put it mildly, kind of an unconventional one. I don't know that she's got the resources to pull out a victory. I mean, if she does win, again, that's an indicator of tsunami level proportions across the country. But I think more realistically, it would not be surprising for a fairly narrow Whitmer win. But where the votes, where you see votes affected, that Alyssa Slotkin, maybe a couple of other of the Detroit suburb Democrat members that were elected in 2018 are in fact defeated because of that Republican-leaning turnout surge, who in effect want to take a vote against both Joe Biden and their governor. Over to you for the others.
All right, yeah. So I'll start with Minnesota. Minnesota is an interesting one. You've got a soft-spoken Dr. Scott Jensen challenging the incumbent Waltz. I'm going to talk a bit about that a little bit more on the next slide, so I'm going to skip ahead. Oklahoma is in play because there seems to be kind of a Chris Kobach type reaction towards Kevin Stitt. Folks are unhappy in the manner he's governing. He's governing a little bit outside the mainstream Republican manner. New Mexico just recently seemed to be put into play. It's very, very unclear as to whether that's actually in play. The polling seems to be trending pretty heavily towards the Democrats, including in the House races. Ron Shetty taking on Luann Grisham. Kansas is your supposed to flip race where you have a Democratic incumbent in a very, very red state. Hard to believe that we don't get Kansas, considering the trend and considering how people feel about the incumbent Kelly, but anything's possible. And then I will spend a little bit more time on my home state, and one I think everybody should be paying attention to is the governor's race in New York. Lee Zeldin has turned crime and the economy into a tremendous message that seems to be outweighing all of the Trump stuff, the Jan 6th focus, the abortion issue. A lot of pro-choice voters backing Zeldin. He's really hammered crime home like nobody else has been able to, because he's been the victim of a near attempted assassination, and then more recently had a shooting in his front yard in Long Island, in a wealthy Long Island suburb where you would not expect gun violence, but that is the nature of Democrat-run New York. Hochul has gone so far as to say that she's the underdog in the race and wasn't expected to win, which is a very interesting take for an incumbent Democratic governor in what could be the bluest state in America. But very interesting race to watch. I can basically say with certainty, if you see Lee Zeldin up on election night, it is going to be one of the best Republican years you've
Yep.
ever seen. And then quickly on these other races, why are they interesting? Iowa AG is held by a Democrat. There's almost no other Democrats holding statewide office in Iowa. He's been a little bit of a squish on crime. Be very surprised if you don't see that flip. New Mexico has kind of the same issue going on, with the AG polling actually being tighter than the gubernatorial polling as a whole. And then Texas is in there because Ken Paxton is under indictment. So you'd think AG probably not somebody you would look at for re-election, but he was able to beat George P. Bush in the Republican primary, and has advanced. So they are seeing that the polls have tightened quite a bit in that Texas AG race. Not sure if it has any down ballot effect, but it is an interesting anomaly to watch for. And then a lot of the media talk around the Secretary of State's roles in Arizona and Georgia as they govern elections. You know, you have kind of the two opposites happening. In Arizona, you have a very, very pro-Trump GOP candidate who's polling quite well, along with Lake. In Georgia, you have Raffensperger, who was the kind of the Republican answer to Trump in some ways, from a media perspective through the 2020 cycle, who's polling far ahead of his Democrat opponent. But
yeah, one thing I'd throw out there too is the candidates who, let's say, have baggage that could be problematic in certain election cycles. The Texas AG has some very serious legal challenges. But again, going back to kind of a corollary to our discussion on Herschel in Georgia and what voters will actually step back and look at, I'm reminded of Louisiana politics, and we've seen this in a number of places. There was a governor, many of you I'm sure would remember, Edwin Edwards, who made the comment, if I'm not caught in bed with a dead girl or a live boy, I'll be elected. And he actually issued a bumper sticker in this 1990s race that said "Vote for the crook," and he was a convicted felon and did quite well. So, you know, this is not getting into a moral position on the individual candidates, but these can be pretty raucous affairs of what's going to viscerally motivate folks. And we're back to a lot of base issues in these races, like Texas and these other battleground areas.
All right, Danny and Jeff, let's go to the last slide. All right, so for each of you, you've listed some races to watch, some predictions for the final outcome, and we've asked for one bold call. Jeff, let's start with you. Tell us about the races we're going to watch, your predictions for the night, and a bold call you're going to make.
Okay, I think three races to watch, and Dan and I both came up with Spanberger, so I didn't want to steal that one from him. The NRCC leadership, by the way, suggests that Spanberger is going to be a private citizen in January, based on trending. Of course, we never know until all the votes are counted. But the coming back to the races that I picked, in Pennsylvania 8, that's the Scranton, Pennsylvania district where Joe Biden is from. Cartwright's done a good job in his time in the Congress to try to sidestep these issues that have been represented by a Republican previously, or actually have been flipped by a Republican previously from a Democrat who had flipped it from a longtime Republican held seat going back to the 90s. That's one to watch. If Cartwright is defeated, I would probably take the corollary step to say that you can comfortably conclude that Oz wins. Georgia 2 with Bishop, I already mentioned that one. Demographics of that seat suggest it's a largely rural district. It runs in southeastern Georgia across to south central, over near Tifton on I-75, and then all the way back to the Columbus-Fort Benning area. If that district, I think that district has a good chance of flipping because of what's happening in the governor's race of Sanford, who's genuinely a decent guy and a decent member of Congress. If he's overturned, and an incumbent is well liked and supported in the state is beaten. I think you see it as a big night nationally. I put New Jersey 7, Malinowski. He's considered a dead man walking by the DCCC right now. However, the reason that I put him in there, especially with the surprise that happened last year in the governor's race in New Jersey, if he's defeated early and there's momentum from Kane on that, the former governor's son, that'll be a great indicator. I would say for me, the sleeper race is the Colorado Bennett O'Day. I think the Senate, to me, I'm calling the Senate. I'll get into my 2 semi-bold calls. 52 plus or minus 1 for the Senate. We might call that 52 plus 1 right now, but I'm going to stick with that number on the House. I've been saying, Andrew can vouch for this since the spring. I think we're 35 plus or minus 5. There's some indication if a lot of these races break, we could be north of 40. But I think that 35, ish number will give a strong working majority to the Republicans. Dan?
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so definitely the Spanberger race, keep an eye on that. That's going to be an early indicator. Polls close fairly early in Virginia, so you can check that early in the evening. Mentioned Rhode Island 2 earlier. Fung is running way ahead of his Democrat challenger. I think that's one. I think those are both bellwether races to watch. I put 3 other ones in here that I think people should keep an eye on for a completely different reason. These are all candidate quality races, and just to see if the Trump effect in moderate to swing districts is going to harm the GOP on election night. There's an indication that might not matter, that things are so bad that Joe Biden's so, riddled with dementia and unaware of where he is, that it does not matter anything besides party. The personalities are not going to play, the candidate quality is not going to play, but I think it's something to take a look at. I picked New York 22. It's a very centrist, almost right Democrat running for an open seat against a very far right GOP selection from a primary, running on very Trumpian issues, doesn't believe January 6th is something that needs to be discussed at all. Came out against tax cuts, very unusual race there. North Carolina 13, you have Bo Hines, a former NC State football player who's very much in that Trump faction, has come out, wants to defund the FBI, get rid of the CIA, kind of unusual positions for a Republican to be taking, and has definitely not matched as well as people thought he was with the district. He's consistently polling down to nickel in a race that we should definitely be winning this cycle. And then I think, kind of for somewhat horrifying reasons, Washington 3 is something to keep an eye on. As Jeff had mentioned earlier, the Joe Kent versus Perez race. This is an unusual race. Kent beat Herrera Butler by about 1,000 votes in a primary, and it's taken on a very unusual turn, with Kent basically trending further to the right post-primary, not trying to moderate his message at all, coming out with stuff that's definitely out of touch with mainstream Republicans, and in terms of support of Putin, open support of Putin, claiming that anybody arrested for Jan 6 is a political prisoner, and some very strange politics coming into play there. So I think the reason I wanted to pick those 3 is just to highlight candidate quality and see where chips may fall. I don't think any of them are going to function as a particular bellwether, but something to look at as the night goes on. Maybe there's some.
Dan, to comment as well, just from your New York roots. Comment on Sean Patrick Maloney, the DCCC chairman's race.
Yeah, so that's another one too that might have a lot of local play into it. So Sean Patrick Maloney is an interesting character to represent a very dynamic district in the Hudson Valley in New York, where it's definitely got a blue tint to it, but Rockland County is a big chunk of the district, which has been trending very, very red in recent years. Mike Lawler is a newly first-term GOP assemblyman who knocked off a 30 or 40-year assembly incumbent. The fact that the DCCC chairman's on defense is a huge indicator as to what's going on. This normally would not be happening. You're not normally talking about leadership going down, but very interesting local dynamics where one of the big voting blocks is the Hasidic Jewish community. It's the fastest growing community anywhere in the United States, averaging 9 children per household. And they vote as a block. There are some of the election returns, if you look at Rockland County historically, their towns will vote something like 6,000 or 7,000 against maybe 10 to 20 votes in the other direction. So a lot of the fight for that voting block is going on. You're seeing Sean Patrick Maloney is calling Mike Lawler anti-Semitic. There's a lot of emphasis on old tweets of his that they're trying to deem anti-Semitic. But the Hasidic voting bloc has a huge problem with Maloney, as they believe he's a gay man who's married to a man. They believe that to be Hello Hashem, which is their version of the worst evil. So they're not really comfortable getting behind somebody like Sean Patrick Maloney, and it's going to be a very interesting night on that. Just some quick predictions. I think the House, we're going to pick up 35 is right in line with Jeff. I think we're actually going to be north of that. I think we're going to be in the low 40s. I think we're going to take the Senate. I don't want to suggest a path because I think there are so many X factors between now and next week. My one bold prediction was going to be that Kathy Hochul loses, but that might be me being too hopeful. I really do think Waltz is going down, though. I think Jensen's a very dynamic candidate, and he offers an interesting perspective coming from the medical field, having served under so many health diktats through COVID.
Danny, and Jeff, thanks so much. I know we're at pushing an hour here, just a little over. I want to take a couple questions. Nathan, I see you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just throw this out there for anybody to answer. But Danny, Jeff, I appreciate the references to some of the House races and other statewide races in the Northeast when you reference Virginia, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, giving us kind of some canaries in the coal mine of which way this thing could go. In the 12 years I've been doing this, the Northwest part of the country has never been in conversation. So could you give me a little bit more color on the Washington, Murray, Smiley, and what's going on with Virginia, with Oregon and Washington right now? Because this has never been a conversation for us in the past.
Yeah, so I think I'll start with that. I think one of the things I'd like to look at, and this is going back to my data consulting roots. If you look at the city attorney's race in the city of Seattle last year, I think this is probably your canary in the coal mine. So I was a data guy on the city attorney's race in Seattle, and when we pulled the numbers in Seattle, how many likely Republicans against how many likely Democrats, even I was a little confused because it was something like 88% likely Democrats to 7% likely Republicans, with 5% as the swing. And you look at something like that and you're like, what are we doing here? This is not even doable. And yet we have a Republican city attorney in the city of Seattle. That was a race that flipped in the odd year, 2021. It was much like the Youngkin situation. I shouldn't say much like the Youngkin situation. It was probably more of an indicator as to what's happening out there than Youngkin could be, because even the most ardent, true Democrat, like small L liberal Democrat, is a little bit fed up with things like Chaz and homeless encampments on every corner. If you look at Oregon, I think Oregon's going to be very interesting, where the Democrat vote is now split. Republicans probably going to win the governorship with 45%. This is all in play on crime. I think it's the economy. I think everything's the economy to an extent right now. But the reason this stuff is coming into play is the crime issue. The crime's out of control. People are seeing it, and people don't want to live in a homeless encampment where their kids can't walk down the street.
Yeah, there's in Oregon, a very similar kind of a thing where you have a Republican that a little more divided electorate the way it went, but they redistricted in a way that put Democrat seats at risk. And the Brad Schneider seat, Brad is a kind of a blue dog, New Democrat type. He's a fairly moderated individual, fairly pragmatic Democrat. Was beaten by a Bernie Sanders progressive, and automatic.
Kurt Schrader, Jeff. Kurt Schrader.
I'm sorry, Kurt Schrader. You're right. My mistake. Senior moment. I apologize. So that's going to be fairly, volatile to watch. The reality is we probably won't know anything about what happens out there until sometime on Wednesday, Wednesday morning, if not later. And the Northwest is interesting. The one thing I'll leave you with too is there's a set of issues that no one's talking about that has really animated a lot of these suburban districts. And that's the same thing that happened in New Jersey and in the Virginia governor's races, is parents are up in arms all over the country, really outside of, across political lines, over some of the stuff that their kids are being taught in schools. And in Florida, during the Florida primary, it didn't get a lot of national press, largely because it wasn't helpful to what the national press likes to talk about. But Ron DeSantis, his political operation supported very aggressive investment in 30 school board seats in urban suburban districts around Florida, and won 25 of those. And I'm talking to members of Republican leadership the last time I was in Washington. They think this is going to be one of those issues that isn't reflecting a lot of data in the polls, that's going to create some surprises on election night in a number of these seats as well. And again, what has caused that break is, Democratic Party's leader, President Biden, had said he's going to be a moderate. In terms of tone, would cover it from a moderate perspective, and not, go down the road to socialism. And in fact, has taken supported policy positions quite the contrary to that. And so I think there's a lot of disbelief, among a lot of suburban voters. And then the last thing, you might want to, just as a wrap up too, Dan, might be worth talking about on the Spanberger race. The Hispanic coefficient has got Democrats. One Democrat told me on the phone last week, she was absolutely terrified of what the impact is going to be nationally with that, because that's one that they've been in denial about. And again, you come back to Hispanic families, either have ties back into countries that were authoritarian countries that had limited opportunity, but there's a strong embrace of faith, family issues, education, and creating opportunity for the future. And speaking to some of the issues the national parties, doing now, not unlike the Hasidic example that Dan gave up in New York, could have extremely profound ripple effects, realigning Republican voting in a whole lot of places around the country.
Jeff,
Yeah.
thanks. Danny, hey, just real quick. Hey, everyone, I understand that we're about 10 minutes past our hour. If you want to take off, I appreciate your time and attention this afternoon. We do have a very exciting race. We'll have more to come as we get closer. Be on the keep an eye out on your email. We'll send something around, a little election night guide, to as well as sort of a detailing of who NRMCA and Concrete PAC have supported, and who you can follow along on election night to get the tally of wins. But Danny and Jeff and I are going to stick around for another few minutes and just continue to sort of chat. So if you want to drop a question or you want to stick around and just pipe up and ask something, please feel free. But otherwise, just appreciate everyone's attention, and we'll make this recording available shortly. So thanks, everyone. And Danny, Jeff, back to you. And Scott, I think you had piped up. You recognize you over there.
I have just a quick question. Excuse me. New York Times released a Siena poll today with results that seem to be contrary to the way some of these battleground state Senate races have been trending. It seems like the media kind of latched onto that poll, but I believe it had Fetterman and Warnock and Kelly all up by 5 or 6 points. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that poll.
I looked at the Siena poll. Actually, I shot this over to Jeff last week, because before the statewide and some of the more nationally followed races had come off, they actually picked out the Amanda Adkins, Sharice Davis race as one that is supposed to be a blowout for Democrats. And it just, there's no way that polling can be accurate. I mean, no matter which way you cut it. You know, being a New Yorker, there is something of a history with a lot of my political background with the Siena poll. The Siena poll was known for being kind of staffed by the Democratic Assembly Campaign Committee. Still mostly former Dem operatives, a lot of them close to the state house speaker there, and the former state house speaker. The pollster on this particular series is a former Democratic political operative. I don't like to chalk everything up to bias, but I think this is absolutely a case of bias. I think it's, you know, want to put on my conspiracy hat a little bit. I think this is almost a suppression poll where they're trying to, you know, bolster Democrat chances where they don't really have that type of chance, and keep the GOP, you know, on the back foot. I have a feeling, you know, you look at the two organizations, it's hard to find two more left-leaning to left-wing groups in the New York Times or the pollsters at Siena. You know, I don't think it's the only thing, but if you look through the numbers that came out today, the Siena poll reverses every trend that we're seeing everywhere else. I don't put a lot of faith in it. And you know, the pollster, his nickname in Republican circles in New York was D+10, which meant whatever the Democrat was going to do, add 10 points to make him look better.
Yeah, I'll say this too, is there's a lot of noise that comes in at the end in a targeted race. You know, we're normal American who has a life and isn't addicted to politics like many of us are, is frustrated during election season because all they see is ads coming from multiple states in their, you know, in their regions over time. The reality can be a little bit different. In my races, one in particular stood out, that all the pundits did a pile on me at the end of the 2006 race when I was Nancy Pelosi's number 5 target, and we were listed as losing by about 8 points. And a surprise poll that was released going into the weekend, we didn't really believe it. It was emotionally unsteady, but we tracked the most reliable poll, if you will, that you can do on a campaign is what's called voter ID calling. That's done from a victory center of your campaign. You got 20 or 30 volunteers, you know, maybe making a combined total of 3,000 or 4,000 calls a day. And then you run that average together. You do a 3-day running average of that, or a 4-day running average. And in all the races I was in where we used that, we always ended within a half a point of what that average was, regardless of what public polling was. And I think what you're seeing reflected in polling corrections that conservatives have made is they're starting to impose this undercounting or these polling errors into their numbers. You know, we could be wrong, certainly, but I feel pretty good that these anomalous polls are not going to hold, you know, based on voter anger factors. You know, if we were at 2% inflation and gas prices were what they were 2 years ago, maybe a different story. But I think the anxiety level of the country is such that I would just ignore those polls and focus on the fundamentals on the ground in these races.
Other questions? Or I did want to build off just quickly, and then if there are no more questions, I think you've heard enough from me. But you know, we do have a question.
I don't have a question. I just wanted to make an after the election comment. I see some things going on that, you know, if the majority party becomes a minority party, say after the election, Steny and what is his Hoyer, Nancy is probably gonna jump ship, and she's gonna take the Italian ambassador's position because it's now open. She's already made a comment about it. Hoyer has made, not publicly, but he has said that if he doesn't get minority whip or House Appropriations leader, he's gonna call it done and retire, and we're gonna end up with a special election in Maryland after the beginning of the year. So those are the two big things I see in the leadership stuff that's gonna happen roughly after the election if they lose majority status.
Yeah, Danny, I think that's a really interesting observation. I mean, I think one of the biggest open questions is what happens to Democratic leadership, especially in the House next Congress. I mean, Jeff, I don't know if you have any insights, but you know, but between, you know, Steny, Clyburn, and Pelosi, I mean, you've got what, 246 years of age. I mean, that's a lot to be clustered up at the top of the Democratic leadership.
And here in Maryland, Steny has nobody that he's backed to move forward. So that will leave Maryland with one of those lovely open elections with 60 people on the ballot, probably.
It's the new reality.
But yeah, that's what I see happening because she's already made inquiry into that position, and that would fill what she would like to do to get out.
There could be a very contentious leadership race on the Democrat side. The tragic assault on Mrs. Pelosi's husband last week puts her in kind of a precarious position. I was talking to one person early today that made the comment that it kind of muddles her message of wanting to pass on. It makes her look like now she's leaving because she really will have to with this head injury. It might make it difficult for her to have a natural transition into the ambassadorship, depending on Paul's health. But I think either way, if they have the kind of losses that we're talking about, they won't be able to sustain it. Another wild card is what James Clyburn decides to do. You get three people in their 80s, and you've got very young members in their 50s, possibly around 60, who really would like to have an opportunity to lead. All three. I think it's going to be a package deal. Either all three stay or go. And I don't have numbers on this, but at least the gossip on the street is that Hakeem Jeffries from New York probably has the catbird position from vote counting right now within the caucus. Adam Schiff is also going to run for Democratic leader, but he's about as unpopular with many of his members internally as he is with Republicans. So, we'll see how that plays itself out. He just has a tremendous fundraising machine. He's also considering a potential Senate run or Senate appointment, depending on what happens with Senator Feinstein. But there'll be a little bit of disarray on the Democrat side, learning the ropes on that. But nonetheless, I think that you're going to see a lot of new faces.
Brett, and then we'll do one last thing, and then we'll call it for the day. Go ahead, Brett.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm just curious if you're hearing any rumbles of Democrats losing their ability to caucus in any state houses in particular. Just curious if you've heard that anywhere. I know Kentucky now, there possibly could be a chance of Democrats not having enough members to be able to actually caucus at the Capitol. So see if you've heard it, or if any of y'all have heard anything like that elsewhere.
Danny?
Well, I think Jeff should really comment on the Kentucky situation. That one, I won't comment Kentucky specifically. In terms of state houses that are contentious, there are a few houses where there are essentially no membership from the other party. If you look at the South Dakota, Wyoming, Idaho, they do maintain small Democratic caucuses. I think the only caucus in the U.S. that is actually exclusively one party is the Hawaii State Senate. But as I said, I'll leave it to Jeff on the Kentucky specific. In terms of state legislatures that might flip, there aren't many. Some people are considering the New York State Senate in play. I don't believe those numbers. I think more likely you're looking at the Maine Senate, Michigan, both houses in Michigan, the Minnesota State House, the Minnesota State Senate is safe Republican. And then an interesting caucus situation, it's probably the most interesting in the country right now, is the Alaska State House, which actually has a Republican majority and a Democrat speaker. There are 3 factions of Republicans who sit in Alaska right now. It's quite a confusing situation. You have 2 Republicans who sit with each other and no one else. Then you have a conservative Republican caucus that is another group. And then the third group is the moderate Republican caucus, which caucuses with the Democrats. So Alaska is really, really screwy this cycle. And it's something I think political junkies should definitely take a look at. It's all ranked choice voting. So you're seeing, Lisa Murkowski could be reelected with primarily Democrat support in the state. And it's the reason the Alaska at-large seat is contentious is because the 2 Republicans refuse to work with one another. And the Democrat is likely to carry a large percentage of the moderate vote. So in terms of that particular incident, that's one of the things I'm seeing. And then in terms of Kentucky internal politics, I don't know it too well. So I'm going to kick that over to Jeff if he has any insight.
Brett, I haven't heard that yet, but I've been a little more federal focused of late. All I can remember off the top is when Jim Bunning was elected to the state Senate in 1982. He was immediately elected the Republican leader of the state Senate with a grand total of, I think, 3 members. So, over time it adjusted. If they get crushed overall, it certainly does present some organizational challenges to them. But interesting. It'll be probably the biggest reflection on that is what's going to come next in the governor's race in 23, which we'll save that for another NRMCA session. But I think likely that indicates that the state, the governor's mansion will change too.
Okay, good deal. Jeff, Danny, thanks so much. I'll appreciate you guys taking the time. Again, we'll make this recording available and we'll put out a little pre-election newsletter, what to look for on election night. And we'll see you all soon. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.